You're listening to episode 314 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Rande Brown joins us to talk about why mindfulness is not a substitute for therapy. Hi, everyone. I want to thank you for supporting the Secular Buddhist Association with your generous contributions. Because of that dana, we're able to continue offering this podcast, the discussions on our website, secularbuddhism.org, and of course, our live online practice circle. And if you haven't yet, you're welcome to visit the website and show your appreciation, as we appreciate you listening in and sharing your own voice in this exploration of the Dhamma in our lives. I often cringe, inwardly and outwardly, when, during a retreat, someone proudly announces they are stopping their prescribed medications because of their experiences. While I certainly find contemplative practice to be helpful in many ways, it's not a cure-all, not magic, and the conditions, which are likely very different from one's at-home routine, can create a false perception of being cured. How would you know if it was the practice or the environment in which the meditation took root as the source of one's change? No one would. Meditation can complement therapy, but it's rarely a full replacement for working through the complexities of a lifetime. Rande Brown, LCSW, is on the board of the William Alanson White Psychoanalytic Society. She writes on Buddhism and psychoanalysis and is in private practice in the West Village in Manhattan. Rande is a founding board member of the Tri-Skull Foundation and was its executive director from 2002 to 2006. So sit back, relax, and have a nice herbal, calm tea. Our guest today is Rande Brown. Rande, welcome to the podcast. Glad to be speaking with you today.
Thank you so much, Ted. I'm glad to be here.
I'm really looking forward to this because when I read your article, which for listeners is linked on the episode page for this episode, it really opened up a couple of different things for me that I'm eager to discuss with you. But let's start by having you tell us a bit about your journey with Buddhism and as a therapist.
Okay, well, I became very interested in Buddhism when I was around 11 or 12 years old because I was not satisfied with the conception of enlightenment or transcendence in Judaism, which was my religion of birth. And so I started to read, and this was in the 60s, and the books were just beginning to really come out. I think the first one was What the Buddha Taught by Walpole Rula.
Yep.
Yeah, which I read when I was quite young. And then also Ginsberg and Kerouac were publishing things with references to more secular form of Buddhism, but I was very, very taken by all of that. And I decided that my path was Zen because I thought it felt very clean to me, very clear and not religious, in fact. And I thought that I could take it all the way to the top without getting involved in a lot of other issues, which is interesting now looking back.
Yes.
It didn't work at all. But anyway, I was young and naive and very passionate. And I decided that I wanted to go and learn Japanese, and that's how I would get myself to a monastery in Japan. So in those days, it wasn't easy to study Buddhism in college, but I was very lucky because in late 60s, early 70s, Princeton, which had the best East Asian Studies department, and there were Buddhist scholars at Princeton, opened up for women. So I got in and I was in the first class of women there, which turned out to be very actually useful because when I graduated, I immediately went to Japan and I was directed by Gary Snyder, the poet, to go to Daitokuji, which is where he had trained in Kyoto. So I went to Daitokuji and I knocked on the door. I was terrified, and Kapori Roshi let me in, and I studied under him for a few years. But as you saw in the article, I found it very masculine and very cold, and it was confusing to me because I wasn't feeling the compassion that I had read about. And I ended up going with a more of a Vajrayana teacher, so an esoteric Buddhist teacher who I studied with for quite a few years. So it was sort of like on the edge of Buddhism, but it took in many, many different traditions. And the man I studied with was a scientist. His name was Hiroshi Mochiyama, and he was doing very advanced studies into the nature of consciousness.
Is he the author of Opening the Hand of Thought, that Uchiyama?
No, it's Motoyama.
Ah, Motoyama.
He wrote Science and the Evolution of Consciousness, which was published by Autumn Press. I translated that book. I started to translate the work of various different contemporary Buddhist and not exactly Buddhist. Often they were sort of outliers, people who were having the same conversation that we're having, basically. What we're interested in is the nature of mind, or I shouldn't assume this of you, but for me, I was interested in the nature of mind. And so if you look at my journey from above, it looks like it's been very circuitous. But in my heart, it's been a straight line. But it's taken me through a lot of different traditions. I've been associated with many different traditions. And oddly enough, I've never ordained. I do not have a Dharma name. I've just kept going. I just kept going. And it led me eventually to psychoanalysis, which is what's so interesting, because I'd been studying the nature of mind from the Eastern perspective seriously for about 20 or 30 years. And I must say that having a very strong meditation practice, which, beginning my training at Daitokuji was like boot camp, It was great because it meant I could go into a meditation situation basically anywhere. I could go to a Tibetan thing up in the Himalayas. I could do whatever, and I was comfortable. I was comfortable both with my mind, and having a strong sitting practice. So those things have served me very, very well. And they also served me when I started to explore. I guess I should tell you, yes, I should. I might want to edit that out. So at one point, I joined with a group of people in 1992, friends here in New York, and we started the magazine Tricycle. And I was very involved in the board and doing events. We used to do something called Change Your Mind Day, which was bringing meditation to many, many people. And I loved doing that. And then I was the executive director of Tricycle for a while, and I was approached by a steering committee of psychoanalysts, mostly from NYU postdoctoral program, the New School, and the White Institute here in New York. And they wanted to do a conference on Buddhism and psychoanalysis. And they basically said, we have the analysts, you have the Buddhists, would you want? I was not interested in Western psychology at all. I never had been. But my board wanted to do it, and it sounded like a really good thing to do. So we put on this conference, and I went to give a welcoming address, and I was going to stay for just a couple of hours in the morning. And I was riveted by the conversation. I ended up staying the whole day. The Dalai Lama was in town. I was supposed to go to the teachings. I never left the conference. I was like, wow, these are really smart people. And the level of the conversation was really interesting. So at the same time, in that same time period, I was training to become a contemplative care chaplain at the New York Zen Center for Contemplative Care. They were just beginning. And I was in training with them, and I was on the floor as a volunteer chaplain at Beth Israel Hospital in the floor probably with the sickest people in the hospital. So there was a lot of dual diagnosis. It was a very stressful place. And because I was a mature practitioner, I thought, oh, I'll be good at this. I wasn't. I was a mess. I was an absolute mess. And the suffering was overwhelming. It was just overwhelming. So one day I just realized I felt like I needed to talk to somebody. I needed some help. So I called one of the psychoanalysts from the Buddhism and Psychoanalysis Conference, happened to be both a Buddhist and a psychoanalyst. And I said, who should I see? And she found me one of the best analysts in New York. And I started to see him. And I thought it would just be for 6 months or whatever until I got stable. And then it became a very powerful and very transformative experience. And one thing that he did, he's not a Buddhist, but he's a relational interpersonal thinker. And one thing that he did say, which I should also do a companion article to the one I just wrote about that therapy is not a substitute. Meditation is not a substitute for therapy, by commenting that he and other supervisors, etc., commented that the fact that I had so much training in exploring different states of mind or being comfortable with the fluctuations of my mind meant that my observer was very strong. So I actually went through the process very quickly. The analytic process, there is sort of an arc. I was with the guy for like 11 years. When I started, I didn't expect to become a psychotherapist. It wasn't like, oh, when I grow up, I want to be a psychotherapist. I never had that thought in my life. It took me completely by surprise. And then when I was quite a bit older, I was in my late 50s, I went back to NYU to social work school and became a therapist. And then I went to the White Institute for 4 years and trained as a psychoanalyst. And now I'm in psychoanalytic and psychodynamic psychotherapy practice in New York. But I do attract a lot of people who are practitioners.
This is such a fascinating history and so many things that I wanted to chat about in that. Part of it is the way you described starting in one place in Zen and benefiting from that, really being comfortable in your practice to be able to go anywhere. And that mirrors my own, and I'm sure many of the other listeners, that was a really good place to really get firm in your practice and really find some stability in that. And also that there was movement, that it wasn't just settling for this, that one of the advantages we have in contemporary society is that you're not limited to whatever the local center happens to be, that you have some options. And granted, there's still a great deal of moving about, but that's much easier to do these days than it may have been 200 or 2,000 years ago.
Even in the 1970s, Ted, I had to pack my, backpack and take off. And I was in Japan, and then I was in India, and I was in Thailand. I was, schlepping all over the place. Now you go to the Hudson Valley in New York State and the Catskills, and you can go to almost every kind of dorm center that, you can do a real sampler, if you want.
Right. And that's such a wonderful advantage we have, in that there may be certain aspects of a given location or teacher or practice that don't sit so well. And of course, one of the things I do suggest to people is really delve into, where is that discomfort coming from? What is the source of that? Is it because it's difficult? Again, like exercise, I don't go to the gym and have a really nice time. It can be strenuous. It can be difficult and beneficial. Or am I just doing the not so helpful way of cafeteria spirituality, where I'm just picking out the things that I like, that support a particular view that I have that are nice and easy. And it sounds like in your own practice, you did a lot of exploration of what Buddhism as a whole, knowing there's not one type, many different kinds had to offer. And you ran into great suffering. That suffering, although it may not have been really in the abstract for you, it really came home when you were on the floor, this location where the suffering was overwhelming. Was that a different kind of experience than you'd had with suffering to that point?
I think that getting into Buddhism so early, I really believed that there was an antidote and a cure to suffering. And then when I ran into hopelessness, when I ran into people who were suffering to the point where they were not hopeless and they felt like they had been forsaken, that was very disturbing to me.
Yeah, as it would and is when encountering that kind of despair. So let's move on then a little bit from that and your work in a strong grounding in Buddhist thought, Buddhist practice, and in therapeutic engagements. Let's talk a little bit about these two related topics. That mindfulness is not a replacement for therapy. I agree with that wholeheartedly, and it's something that is always something I always notice when I see online someone who is struggling with a difficulty, and they ask about that in a Buddhist forum of some kind, and their answer is, "Oh, just said, oh, Buddhism has all the answers. Buddhism is perfect. It's just a matter of this perfect, easy solution," and that might not really be the case. So there's mindfulness not being a replacement for
And
therapy.
if I may add,
Please.
also be dangerous.
Yes, exactly. And in addition, so that's there's suffering and engaging with it, and that mindfulness practice may not be a replacement for therapy. It is not. And then another side of this, another coin of that is spiritual bypassing. Many listeners have heard of this before, which to me seems another way of dealing with suffering, and that is by avoidance. And so I want to talk a bit about each of these. I'm wondering, how do these commonly show up in the lives of the people that you see professionally or in Buddhist circles? What do you encounter a lot of the time?
Well, I always like to start with myself, actually, because I know myself better than I know any of my patients. And what happened with me is I was very anxious as a child, and I used meditation not to get to the root of my anxiety, to kind of smooth it over. And then when I was on that floor at Beth Israel, I suddenly experienced this blossoming of I think of it as my emotional body. And I realized that I had not been paying attention to my emotional body. And I became very destabilized for a while. I mean, I was very upset, and I was very anxious before I went to the hospital. I was nauseous. I was somaticizing it a little bit. And I was just kind of took my breath away because I thought I was a really together meditator. And so did all of my supervisors at Zen Contemplative Care. Everyone was like, oh, you're going to be great at this. You're as solid as a rock, and I wasn't. It wasn't a rock. There were issues that I don't want to get too psychologically minded or, too much jargon. I don't think is useful. But I mean, there were some real issues that I had been struggling with since childhood, really, since I was quite young. And I hadn't addressed them. It's like pretty simple, actually. And then when I was in analysis, I got in touch with him, I started to cry. I started to cry, started to admit that I was sad, something I never would have admitted because I was, that I wasn't sad all the time. I'm not particularly depressed, but I mean, there were times I was very anxious, was very worried, and I was very sad at different times. And I think that having the container that I built through the years of meditation, when I finally opened up the emotional body, I think I was able to process through it quite quickly, actually, and I learned a tremendous amount, and that I bring to the people I work
Yeah.
with.
I
And
imagine it was quite jarring for you to go into this situation where there's great encouragement and validation that you'll be good at this, you'll be fine because you have this practice, and then to suddenly find that not only is the suffering itself overwhelming, but holy crap, what's going on here that I wasn't as resilient, or whatever term is appropriate. Understanding resilience has some problems too. What was
thank
that like?
you, articulation. It was just, I got really shaky. I felt faint at one point. I was like, am I losing my mind? I had one of those moments. And when I was a little girl, I was afraid of going crazy. And I had also papered all of that over. And when I did it through my own therapy, I got to a point where I now have confidence that I will not go crazy and I can contain a tremendous amount of distress for other people. That's kind of what I'm known for in my practice, actually, is that it's hard to rock me. It's hard to shake me. I can really sit with a lot. So creating that container for other people, we do our own work. We can't do the work for anybody else. We all have to do the work. But I do feel that there is, for me, it's very gratifying that I'm able to, in my consulting room, create a safe space where people can really do whatever level of emotional work they need to do.
Right. One of the things that you mentioned was how recommendations of doing the practice instead of therapy can be dangerous.
Yeah.
And I do want to chat about that for a minute, because I agree. And for listeners who are aware that I also do another podcast, Present Moment, Mindfulness Practice and Science, we had a conversation. Actually, we've had several conversations about this, one in particular with David Treleaven, the author of Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness. And I'm wondering, Randy, if you might share just a little bit about your own thoughts on how that can be dangerous. How does that show up?
Well, there's an old meme in psychotherapy, right? That half the patients show up because they want you to condone their neurosis. They want they want to know that they don't want to change. They just want to know that they're okay, that it's okay to be as neurotic as they are. Well, it's sort of based, it's sort of the same thing. Sometimes people just don't want don't want to change. Change is really scary. And even if people are really suffering, there's all kinds of defense mechanisms and there's all kinds of way of being in denial. And especially when you sort of idealize the guru, that sort of idealization can take up a lot of psychic energy. And meanwhile, all the stuff that's out of awareness, that's sort of percolating, continues to percolate. And also, I in no way disrespect heritage Buddhism because I've been involved in it for so many years, but I made my own peace with it. Do you know what I mean? I didn't drink the Kool-Aid necessarily, but I've always been very respectful and appreciative of, things within their own context. But individual psychology. I lived in Japan for 12 years. I spent a lot of time in India. And individual psychology is really not something that most patriarchal Zen teachers are particularly interested in, frankly. They do not see it as their moral or ethical responsibility to help somebody feel emotionally healthy.
Right. And it's so interesting because that's not the intent of what their practice is necessarily. It may be simply the extinguishing of a delusion of self or any number of things they might have in mind in their practice. And there's still people who can be greatly harmed.
Where I wanted to go with this was to say that our neurotic thoughts, our illness, our monkey mind, our unhappiness, our attachment, whatever it is, that stuff, if you just let your own mind ruminate on it endlessly, that's where people get in trouble, because there's nothing that's really witnessed if they're not in real conversation with the teacher or with another human being. They can just perseverate, they can just, and they can just build in to a delusional loop that can become psychotic. And that's where the real danger is. When I was in Japan and India in the 70s and 80s, there were people, frankly, excuse me, but they were having psychotic breaks all over the place. And where I was studying at a scientific research institute in Tokyo, which kind of specialized in, we had an acupuncture clinic and some very good counselors. And it actually specialized in treating people who, there were a lot of, I'm sure you're aware, this is not Buddhist, it's not Buddhist, so I can say it, but, there were those gurus that had many, many followers in India and large communities and were doing some kind of off the wall practices, right? And people were freaking out. People were, they were having some very sick, some people died. There were suicides, so there were unexplained Kundalini awakenings. That's a whole other area. But, so I've been aware of this as a phenomenon for a very long time.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things that, for example, Wilby Britton's work at Brown, having to do with how many people who sign up for a particular retreat actually finish it or are okay, and is there follow-up, and is there adequate resources in place to help people who are having difficulties? And that's not always so.
That's right. I helped organize the Karmapa's visit to New York in 2000, and I remember 11 or something, his first visit outside India to the city, and I was so impressed because we actually had mental health practitioners in the audience, which was such an enlightened thing for, I felt for the Tibetans to do, because people who had been very devoted to the last Karmapa, and, they wanted somebody to help people who had entered emotional states that they were having trouble containing. So it takes and will take many forms, I think, going forward. I think that this synergy and this intersection of Buddhism and psychoanalysis is the most interesting place on the planet right now.
Yeah. So there's another aspect of it. So we've been talking about mindfulness is not a replacement for therapy, that therapy is more so about one's individual story, working with a story and with whatever their history may be. That's therapy. And that contemplative practice may be in particular in Buddhist circles, may be more about the gestalt of human experience and suffering. And that's a kind of a different thing. It's on a different level. Let's also chat a bit about the spiritual bypassing aspect, which is, to me, reads like an avoidance of a particular problem. I'm wondering about your thoughts on that.
I feel very strongly that, especially because of all the idealization and guruization that goes on in many, Buddhist circles, that it can put a very strong wall, it's a defense mechanism, but a really, really powerful one, right? Because you feel like you yourself are somehow better than normal. There's a sense of exceptionalism that can come with it, right. With the guru and with the practice, and that you're somehow purified, you're more pure or more spiritual, and therefore you have, by default, almost transcended normal, ordinary human bullshit stuff, and that's where the disconnect comes. I mean, the ideal Zen is you're fully with it. I mean, I still love Zen. I still have a strong Zen practice, but not in subservience to a teacher. But that, I think, more, that holier than thou, the holier than thou thing that you could smell in Dharma communities, excuse me, but, has always been very disturbing to me.
I've been using the term emptier than thou for a few years now.
That's very good. Yes. But the whole, taking in the asymmetrical, it is by nature when there's a guru and the disciples in there, that sets up a hierarchy and where people are within that. And they might as well belong to a corporation. I think that people can get very, very obsessive and very attached to ideas of transcendence that are enormously satisfying to them, is like what they're doing with their lives, kind of,
Right.
but it leaves out a big part of what's actually happening in their being.
Yeah, and it seems that there's a great deal of weight given to the identity as a meditator, and I've done this myself, is you run into, for example, issues that have come up in various Buddhist circles of teachers behaving badly, let's say, and those who continue to support them despite very clear evidence of misdeeds. And it strikes me as being the sunk cost fallacy. The gamblers put in this money. Oh, but maybe this next one. Oh, but I've put in all this investment into it, and this is who I am. And so there's really a pushing away of criticisms of real harm done in favor of, but they also do this good teaching. They also feed the squirrels. I'm like, well, yeah. And
they even have a word for it, right? A term, crazy wisdom.
Right.
Right? Which I think if you're a yogini running around in calm, free as a bird, that's fine. But, it may be fine. But I mean, the evidence of it as it gets translated, whether it's gender politics or whatever, hasn't gone so great. The whole thing about, sorry, but just Asian men and beautiful blonde life, 18-year-old disciples. That mix has been very, but it's very real too.
Right.
It's very real. And I think we're going to, with what's going on in some of the larger communities now, I'm optimistic actually, as a woman. I mean, I'm really optimistic that the Dharma is going to evolve in America in a way that's going to be priceless. I have a whole lot of, as you can imagine, a lot of thoughts about the notion of bodhisattvahood, which I think is another one of those things like crazy wisdom that has been, I wouldn't say there's some very reductionistic views of it that I don't think are very helpful.
Yeah, I think it strikes me as any kind of postmortem assertion or identity goal, and these are words that are typically not smiled upon when discussing things like bodhisattva vows, which I have taken.
Yeah,
and again, not knocking them. We have both done them. We see the value in them. It's not that. It's when that vow and that identity, because it is an identity, takes a position of privilege over what we're really seeing in this very life right now.
Reality. When it takes reality.
Right, reality. And so when I see, for example, something that we run into being an organization, the Secular Buddhist Association, that is very much a proponent of seeing things as they are, which to me is a part of mindfulness and Buddhist practice. Seeing things as they are acknowledges that there is white privilege and gender bias and racism and implicit bias, and that affects our communities. So that when there is for example, person of color retreat, I just did an interview released a few weeks before this recording with Jelani about person of color retreat that IMBE is doing. And that's a good thing because people do need a place where they can be heard and not have that subtle, sometimes very powerful feeling of insecurity that is attenuated when with one's own group. And that's why people of color retreats are extremely valuable. And it's frustrating when I see typically white people criticizing those as, oh, that's just, supporting identity and that's wrong. That's not what Buddhism is about. I was like, no, it's acknowledging reality, and a reality that you or I as a white person can never truly understand because it's not our experience. That's not the context of our living. And that is also what this practice is for.
Yes. But ultimately, there's the self and other, right? And Black people are othered all the time. And so when they're together, they can let that go. So that's, to me, the value of a lot of these conferences and retreats that are going on now. But at the same time, ultimately, I don't know if we've really talked about emptiness, but that's what we're talking about. And so the interdependence of all being, right? And that's dependent chain of origination is the first thing the Buddha taught when he was enlightened. It was not the Four Noble Truths, as I know you, sure you know very well. But it's changing. The situation is changing. But when I first got back from Asia and was trying to find a Buddhist community here or Buddhists that I could talk to, I was really staggering to me how many people didn't get that. They just didn't get it. And they weren't teaching, people were getting advanced empowerments and they didn't even have Buddhism 101. I was kind of like, ugh. But anyway, that's really changing now. But yes, ultimately, it is about the fact that it is truly interdependent and therefore there is no hierarchy.
So, Randy, I wanted to shift just a little bit, is that we've been talking about mindfulness is not a replacement for therapy. We've also talked about spiritual bypassing, what I see as perhaps two sides of a very similar coin and how we deal with suffering. And I'm wondering what some of the ways you've suggested people watch out for those. Understanding that each person's circumstances are unique, are there some things that you tend to recommend to those when they're either encountering thinking practice as a replacement for therapy, or they may be doing some spiritual bypassing?
Well, it is very individual. And I don't want to give too glib of an answer, but my real answer is that you have to talk about it. You really have to talk about it with another person because there's something about having it witnessed that changes it. By the way, I'm sure there are meditation teachers who do this all the time and do it very well, but it was just not my experience, right? It was just not my experience. So, but that's, I'm in no way trying to draw a generality from that. But I will, people do come to me. And frankly, with some people, I would say it's kind of interesting, actually, how many of my patients have become meditators, even meditation teachers during their tenure with me in therapy and how that has helped them, But I also have people who have been, severely traumatized by their relationship with their teachers. And I work with them the same way I work with anybody who's been traumatized by an authority figure, which is really investigate it, really look into it, have their feelings again in a safe space, start to metabolize those feelings and hopefully build a more cohesive sense of self, which I know in this conversation is funny, but you have to have a self, whatever, that thing that I don't actually like that quote, but a cohesive sense of self in this world is very important. And when one is traumatized, there are often rents and holes and, the fabric isn't holding together so well. So when people build a more cohesive sense of self, they feel more agency in the world. They feel like they can make choices. And I often say that the object of therapy is not happiness, it's ease. And so if it makes life easier, whether they continue as meditators or, however they integrate it, the idea is that they feel more empowered and more at ease.
Thank you, Randy. And for those who are listening, I'll have links. If you'd like to get in touch with Randy, I'll have some links that will help you with that. And I hope you'll join us again because I would like to speak with you about the book. We'll do a separate episode about that. Our guest today, Randy Brown. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Ted. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org. and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.